Hello there! So today I am going to be reviewing and discussing the Broken Earth Trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. So I'm just going to start out with a non-spoilery review / discussion before I get into the spoilers. So this book is a sci-fi / fantasy that focuses, at least on the first novel, on 3 different perspectives. 3 characters. The main person we're focusing on is Essen, who is a Eurogene. Now, a Eurogene is a person with powers to quell earthquakes. They can sense changes in the faults in the earth, and it does help as far as preventing, natural disasters. But on the flip side, it is the reason why they're discriminated against. For centuries, for a really long time, these people have been discriminated against in this world. The only way to really fit in is to be a part of the fulcrum, which is where they train young Orogenes, and from youth to adulthood, they learn how to use their powers in a safe way in order to not cause any natural disasters. So the story is told from a second-person point of view, which is interesting because you usually don't hear about that, and it's also, focusing on Essen, and Essen's story starts with the death of her son, and her son dies at the hands of her husband, Jija. So as a result, Jija runs away with her daughter, Nassin, and Essen's left in the town of Torimo, I believe, and it takes her a while to process what's happening, and during the aftermath, as she's leaving the town, people find out she's a Eurogene. They try to attack her, and she ends up destroying the town, and she has to go out on the road in order to find and save her daughter. And as this is happening, you also have Cyanide, who is a Eurogene at the Fulcrum, who is being, at the start of the novel, used as a breeder. So she comes in contact with her mentor, Alabaster, and she's supposed to have babies with him. So we see her story, as well as Alabaster's story, unfold. The story goes on. And the third perspective we have is Demaya, a young girl who is discovered by a guardian named Shafa, and, she's taken to the Fulcrum to learn how to use her Eurogene powers for, I guess, good? Or I guess for the least amount of, chaos. So by and large, this book for me is really enjoyable because I think it not subverts, but it is different from a lot of fantasy novels in that it's obviously very much rooted in sci-fi, but I feel like it's more grounded than a lot of fantasy that I've read in the past. Like, it's, a realistic depiction of discrimination against a people, and also everything that goes with it, the system, the society. And also in this novel, there's a very prevalent caste system, and your caste is based on your use. So there are, strongbacks, which are people who are physically strong, breeders who are, they're attractive, they're good for breeding, so they are used to make babies because they have the attributes that are good in different parts of the world. So for, a Sanseed, ash-blonde hair, which is like gray hair that I guess sticks up, is seen as, attractive. So they would breed people who have those sort of attributes. There's also a Resistant, there's also Loris, which are people who, tell the stories that in some cases become teachers or mentors. And then there are the people at the Fulcrum who try to, use their origin powers to help in different kind of situations. So Cyanide, for example, with Alabaster, goes to this coastal city and there's something in the water, and she has to figure out what's going on there. And, only Eurogenes can really do that. If you're still, i.e. a person that, doesn't have Eurogeny, that doesn't have powers, you won't be able to detect certain things in the earth, in the water, etc. Another big thing about this series is that there's a lot of new terms that you have to know. Like there's literally an appendix at the back of the book so you know what's going on. And what I didn't do was I didn't look at that before I started reading. So I was kind of just like learning what everything meant as I read instead of looking in the back like, oh yeah, this is what a fulcrum is. But you know, I think it's easy to understand as you go on, especially towards like the end of the first book. You start to piece everything together and what certain things mean. Like it's not difficult to understand, but it does help to have that at the end. And like I said, although Eurogenes, you know, have the ability to manipulate, you know, thermal and kinetic energy to stop, you know, natural disasters, they are discriminated against. Like there's a term called roga, which is the derogatory way of saying Eurogene, which is what, you know, a lot of people say in the book. And it's like, I feel like it gets worse as it goes on, because the more you hear it, you're just like, ugh, this doesn't feel right. You shouldn't be saying this. But yeah, it's this discrimination that's been, as we find out later in the novels, it started like where it started, and that it's been lasting for like, you know, a couple centuries at this point. And this book also has really good representation as far as LGBTQ plus representation. And, you know, it does focus a lot on, you know, oppression, discrimination, you know, caste systems, as well as, you know, the apocalypse. So in this world, because of, you know, there is this kind of lore that a long time ago, something was taken from Father Earth, and Father Earth got angry, so he punished, you know, the world and also humanity by having seasons. So what seasons are, they are an extended winter lasting at least 6 months per imperial designation, triggered by seismic activity or other large-scale environmental alteration. And the way seasons work is it's different each season. So, you know, there's one season where it's caused by a volcanic eruption. The other one is caused by, you know, an earthquake or like a tsunami or other things like that. So it's not always the same, and every season is not the same. So it's like you don't really know what's gonna happen until it happens, but Eurogenes can kind of sense when it happens. So Essen, for example, knows that there's gonna be a season and knows that it's gonna last a really long time at this point. I think, yeah, as far as this novel, I think that it's one that you have to pay attention to, and it's one that as you read more, you kind of understand the world better. As far as the world building, it's very hefty, so it's like, hence why there's an appendix at the end. Like, you need to kind of understand what's going on, but you can kind of understand it's happening. But I think like once you get to, you know, the second book in the trilogy, the third book, you'll like understand everything that's going on. It's just, for me, like the first like 100 pages, I was kind of confused. I was like, what is happening here? Like, I don't know what's going on. I know there's a Eurogene thing, and then there's the other thing, and yeah, I was a little confused until a certain point where I just kind of got it. So I think for like other people, it may be just like, maybe you'll get to a certain point and get it. But like I said, I really enjoy the series. I think, you know, as the series goes on, you kind of pick everything up faster, and everything's a little easier to understand and digest by the time you understand, you know, the caste system, for example, or like the idea of Eurogenes, or like the idea of like seasons, like what that even means or what it entails. Especially as the series goes on, you see what happens in a season, or at least this particular season, and you know how people deal with it. But at this point, I'm gonna get into more spoilery territory. So if you haven't read the Broken Earth trilogy, please go back and read it, because there are going to be tons of spoilers for the entire series from here on out. Okay, so spoilers. At least for the 5th season, I knew right away, not right away, it took me a little while, but I knew by like page 100-ish that, you know, Demaya, Cyanide, and Essen were the same person, because I think it was like the way they were described physically. I was like, oh, so they all have the same appearance, they all have gray eyes, interesting. And they're all in different stages of their lives, almost like this is the same person but at different stages. Yeah, it's the same person. And you know, by the time we get to, it's actually not even the end of the book, it's a certain point in Demaya's training at the Fulcrum as a grit, after right before she has to take her test for the rings, to get a ring as a Imperial Eurogene. She tells her guardian Shafa that, you know, her Eurogene name is going to be Cyanide. So that's kind of where Jemisin and Cyanide converge in their paths, at least in their stories. And I really like how this was told. Like, even though like I kind of knew like this was the same person, I think it was interesting to hear like how different they were in different parts of their lives. The fact that they had different names and just went by completely different names, different identities for each part of the book. I really like that aspect of it. And also there are not parallels, I would say, but there are people that Demaya/Cyanide/Essen meets throughout her life that, she ends up meeting later in the novel. So for example, at the Fulcrum, she meets a person from the leadership cast named Beanoff, who ends up being another character, well, the same character but by a different name, later on when Essen meets her again. So I thought that was like an interesting thing. And also in the next book, there's another character from the Fulcrum that Demaya knew as a child that Essen ends up meeting. So I also think like that's kind of cool, like how, it's a small world and all that. Like these people kind of come back and meet each other again, but of course in very different circumstances. And also just to touch upon like the representation in this, you really see it in terms of, at least in the first book, in terms of Inin, who, when Cyanide and Alabaster end up on their trip to Alia to, fix this anomaly in the water, turns out there's an obelisk there. I don't know if I'm saying that right. But yeah, there's like this gemstone there that's like trapped in the water, and a guardian comes because, they did something they weren't supposed to do. And in order to get out, they travel through okay, so they meet a stone eater named Antimony. So stone eaters are this kind of humanoid, being that's made of stone that doesn't move the same way as humans. So it's kind of like an uncanny valley thing there. But the point is, they end up in this island called Meoff, and there they meet this guy named Inin, who is a pirate. And Inin is, if not bisexual, pansexual. He's attracted both Alabaster and Cyanide. So they end up having this thing, and it kind of cuts like 2 years into the future, because it turns out Cyanide at the end of one chapter is pregnant, and then we see like the baby's like 2 years old. So they're on the island for about 2, nearly 3 years. So they're there for a while, and they kind of had this like throuple going on. And yeah, so that's the first instance. The second instance is, of course, Tonki/Beanoff. Beanoff is who we meet when, Essen is younger. She's transgender, and like part of that was like being in a leadership cast from Humanist. It wasn't good for, I guess, her ability to marry, so she ends up becoming a geomist. She ends up becoming a scientist and going to the university. So she's not really in like the leadership cast as much anymore. So the first book sort of ends with, on the road, Essen meeting up with this strange boy named Hoa, and that's also like around the time she meets up back with Tonki and realizes that she's like under the disguise of being calmless, but she's not. She was actually like, undercover or whatever. And she also stumbles upon this calm of Castrema, and they live underground. And because there's a season coming, they're kind of stuck there. Like, she can't go and find her daughter Nessun right away because of the fact that, like, well, the season's starting, and also there's like these bugs that just kill people inside apparently. So we have to stay here and be a part of this calm for a while. And also, kind of around the same time, we also see like with Cyanide and Alabaster, the guardians from the Fulcrum are coming on the island. They found them somehow, and they come attack them, and in the midst of all this chaos, Cyanide ends up killing the child in order to save him from a fate worse than death. And also Inin ends up dying, and Alabaster is taken by the Stone Eater Antimony and kind of like in the stone at this point. So after all this happens, she ends up changing her name, starting a new life, and marrying, now we're called up, Jija, and having the 2 children, Nasen and Yuchi. So we kind of see like throughout her life how everything unfolds, how she got to the point where she is now, searching for her daughter, and how, there are sort of parallels between her whole entire life. At this point, the first book ends with Essen at the Calm Castrema, and Alabaster comes with the Stone Eater, and he's like, hey. He shows up. He's like partially covered in stone because as he's, using the power of the obelisk, he turns into stone, and Antimony, the Stone Eater, eats the stone. So he's kind of like slowly dying, and he meets up with Essen, who he's trying to teach how to, conquer the obelisk and be able to, like, fix the world again. And the story ends with him saying, like, have you ever heard of the moon? Which sets up the rest of the series at this point, because the idea is Father Earth, and as far as stone lore, as far as the history and the stories, it says that he lost his child, which was the moon, and the moon is kind of lost and not really orbiting the planet anymore. So that might be why seasons are happening, because Father Earth got mad, or maybe because of the fact that the moon is tied to many things. So, the idea is like, we have to go catch the moon, and that kind of sets up like the rest of the series at this point. So the second book starts with Nassin. So we start to see the story told partially from Nassin's POV, and the journey she's taking with her father Jija, and they're getting away from the town, and Jija, turns out he's looking for this place called Found Moon, which, because he hates Orogenes, part of the reason why he killed his son, he doesn't want his daughter to be an Orogene. So from what he heard, there's this way to unmake them, to take away their powers. So that's why he takes her to Found Moon. It takes them a while to get there, but once they get there, guess who Nassin meets? Shafa, her mother's guardian when she was a child. And while she's there, she learns to use her powers better. She's with other kids who are also Eurogenes, and they're taken to this Found Moon place. But as they kind of set up in this town, which the town is actually called Jekity, but their little, I guess, community is called Found Moon, she just slowly starts to realize that, like, hey, Nassin, you're not really losing your powers. They think you're using them more. And then Nassin has to be like, what are you talking about? I am not doing what you think I'm doing. Also, as this is happening, we're still following Essen's story while she's still in Castrima, and the fact that Alabaster is trying to teach her how to use the obelisk in order to, catch the moon. And also, as this is happening, a lot of things go down. Hoa comes back again, but he comes back as his stone form. So Hoa's a stone eater, even though he first appeared to Essen as this young boy. That's not really his form. So he comes back at some point like, hey, I'm actually a stone eater. What's up? And he's like a grown adult, and it's kind of like confusing, because it's like, wait, you're not a kid. And I was still picturing him as a kid for a while, so had to get used to that for a bit. And there's also a calm called Rhiannis that comes and once, is it enslave or just kill and take over Castrima? One or the other. The point is, a calm comes, and there are a lot more people in that calm, and they're a little bit more powerful. So, there's that risk there. But, Essen manages to using the obelisk to capture the stone eaters that they have on the other side, but also to destroy the town of Rhiannis. So that town is like destroyed, all the people in there are dead. So after that happens, she kind of falls into a coma, because that's a lot of power to be using. But while this is happening, Nassin meets a stone eater herself called Steel, and he's talking to her, and she's learning about the obelisk more, and the fact that she's so young and able to do all this as a Eurogene. She's very powerful. So by the time we get to the end of the book, we know that the stone eater has convinced her to catch the moon. So that's where Nassin leaves off at this point, but it's also what like Essen is trying to do. So like I said, there are a lot of parallels here. Also, by the time we get to the last book in the series, I forgot to mention something really important. Yeah, Essen accidentally ends up killing Alabaster. Not a big plot point or anything. That's nothing important. It's just something I forgot to mention. A little minor detail there. So in this book, we see that Hoa recounts his past. So we get to know like the start of like how he became a stone eater, and how everything started. So apparently there were these this group of people called Nias, I think I'm saying it right, who had similar powers to the Eurogenes now, and that Hoa and the other people who weren't always stone eaters but now are stone eaters descended from, or at least were bred to be similar to that group of people, in order to use this mix of Eurogenie and magic called tuning in order to make the obelisk. I think I'm counting that right. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what was happening. Okay, I got it. It's geoarcanity is the thing that they are doing to for the town of Seal Angus, which is from where Hoa's from, where it gets its power or magic or Eurogeny from. Yeah, I was trying to like remember the word, but yeah, that's the word it means, and that's where, you know, the obelisk kind of started, where they came from. So that's happening, and also Nassin, after, you know, killing Jesus, killing her father, although he was gonna try to kill her first, so I guess it was self-defense, you know, she turns him into stone, and then her, Shafa, go right away to the Dead Civ, which I think is Seal and Angus, which is where Hoa is from, you know, by the orders of Steel, the Stone Eater that, you know, contacts Nassin. So while that's happening, the other Eurogene kids from Found Moon go on their way somewhere else. Yeah, that's what happens. So that happens, and we end up traveling to this dead civilization with this big city that has like these kind of is technologically advanced. Like they have these things that are sort of like vehicles that can take you underground. But while that's happening, it also hurts Shafa because I forgot to mention the core stone in his neck. So all guardians, in order to, you know, be able to live a certain long time, and like it's connected to the fact that they're very resilient, they have this thing in the back of their necks that's implanted. That is the reason why they have this longevity, and also part of the reason why they can control the Eurogenes in a way. Yeah, that was a really important tidbit of information that I forgot to mention. Like, how did I skip over that? Just like Essen killing Alabaster. How did I skip over that? That's pretty important plot point that I was just like, you know, that doesn't matter. That never happened. But yeah, as this is happening, you know, Nassin starts to see Shafa as this new father figure. You know, she, you know, becomes fond of him and he's fond of her. So like as they're traveling, she notices like he's often in pain and she wants to take his pain away. But the pain is happening because of the core stone in the back of his neck, which is part of the reason why, like, when they're in the dead civilization and they take, you know, this vehicle down under the earth, he kind of is like in all his pain and like passes out. And we later see that when we get to Core Point, which is where she is meant to catch the moon and, you know, work with all these obelisks, but also that's where Essen is supposed to do it, we find that Warrant, which is where, you know, all this time Shafa was saying he's from, you know, his name is, you know, Shafa Guardian Warrant, and your last name is where you're from, but no one ever knew where Warrant was. It was just a big mystery. So yeah, apparently Warrant is underneath Core Point, which is also where Alabaster was during all that time before he came to Castrema. He was in Core Point with all the Stone Eaters, and how he was like, you know, learning about what was going on, as to which like Antimony taught him. And as this is happening, you know, Essen is continuing to use her powers, but trying to use it sporadically, because similar to how Alabaster was slowly turning into stone, she slowly is too. So the more she uses her Eurogeny at this point, as far as like with the obelisk, she's gonna turn into stone. So she's trying to, you know, be minimal as she's using this. But on the other hand, her and the whole comm of Castrema are still on their way to Rihanna's because it's a safer place to be. However, you know, there's a lot of danger there. So the problem is she is the strongest Eurogene there, but there are other Eurogenes that can do, you know, that can cess and that can, you know, quell seismic activity, but still, like, I guess she still was useless in this way, but it's also like, I mean, you still have to like save the world, so, you know, try not to, you know, do anything. Pretty much is like what she has to do for a while. And I think, like I said earlier, how, you know, the usage of Eurogene and Roga is the more derogatory way of saying this, and it becomes like more evident as the story goes on. And literally on page like 220, there's a moment where, you know, another character says Roga, and then, you know, Essen's like, no, Eurogene, it's not Roga, you don't get to say Roga, you haven't earned that. So it's like this kind of way of like, people who are Eurogenes themselves can say it because it's kind of, they're repurposing it for themselves, you know, similar to how that happens in real life. So kind of like that little tidbit there. I think that only happens once, where like she says it like in that way of like, you know, having the ability or being able to have earned the right to say it. But you know, I think it's interesting, especially to put like in this world, because usually like in other fantasy worlds there is like discrimination, but there's not, you know, something like, you know, a derogatory term, or like, you know, the possibility of repurposing, you know, this kind of term that's used to put down this group of people. So it's like, it's refreshing to see in this book at least. So while Nassin is in Core Point, she has to kind of take care of Shafa, who is like, you know, injured after being underground, and his like core stone is, I just realized, Core Point, Core Stone. Wow, yeah, that never dawned on me, but it has dawned on me now. So yeah, of course Warren is underneath Core Point. It's literally called a Core Stone. How did I not put two and two together? Anyway, we well, yeah, Nassin discovers, you know, these notes that Alabaster has written while he was in Core Point with the Stone Eaters, and you know, his thought process is kind of like gone. Like, even like the way he writes, he gets off topic, or he like scribbles things out. Like, you can tell like he's not in the right state of mind as he was writing these notes in his journal. And as this is happening, Essen discovers the reason why she's missed her period with Mr. Menzies is because she's pregnant, because, you know, her and Lerna became a thing while in Castrima. She doesn't think of it this way at first. She's thinking, oh, well, you know, my body's in starvation mode, that's why I haven't had a period. No, turns out she's pregnant. And that's a problem, because using the gates is more than likely going to kill her. So it's a matter of, well, yeah, do I let me and this unborn child die, or do I let my daughter Nassin, who's already alive, die, and let her control the gates even though she's like a child? So, you know, it has that moral dilemma. But, you know, ultimately, because Perigee, which is when the moon comes back, happens in like a day or two, that's what Hoa tells her, so she just decides to do it. And as this is happening, she takes Lerna, she takes Tonki with her to Core Point. So when they go in this underground thing, so yeah, Stone Eaters can move underground, and they can also take people with them. So that's what Hoa does in order to get to Core Point. And it takes a while, and they're also like the Stone Eaters that are trying to attack them because they don't want the moon to like come back into the orbit. So they're trying to stop them. And in the midst of all this, even though Essen manages to fight them off as they're traveling, Lerna ends up disappearing, and we can only assume that he died because he's not there anymore. So by the time they get to Core Point, she has to deal with the fact that, like, you know, he's gone, but she also still has to find Nassin. And like, this is also the point where it gets more sci-fi. So later on, we find out, like, as the story of like Hoa's, you know, origin story is being told, we find that, you know, they're on the moon, and they're trying to like harness enough power in this thing called a plutonic engine. And as this is happening, him and all the, you know, pre-Stone Eaters agree to like botch the mission in order to, I guess, the revenge, payback, you know what, for reasons. They do it for reasons. So what Hoa does is he uses the obelisk as well as the other group to, you know, destroy Silang Angus, which is where they lived, because of like, you know, all the things that him and his people were put through. And like, it's hard to describe. It's like you would have to read it yourself to really understand like what's happening like on the page, because it's like, I don't know how to describe what's happening. Like, I can picture it sort of, but it's like I don't know, it's like in a real like Star Warsy thing that I'm picturing in my head. So it's like with magic. So I don't know how to describe it, but like if you are reading it, you'll know what I'm talking about. So right after this, we get into the nitty gritty, where Nassin decides to change the world, and she's going to, you know, as she's about to, you know, command the gates, the obelisk, Shafa comes up, and he's like walking around, and he's like, good again. And of course, Nassin's like, hey, Shafa, where are you going? And this is where we see, you know, Warren, which is under Core Point. So as they're down there, we see other guardians who are, you know, like asleep. And this is where Shafa goes to this device and he gets his core stone taken out. So he mentioned earlier in this novel that like when he takes out the core stone, it's going to undo like this kind of anti-aging thing that it did, which means he's gonna die sooner or later. And given that it's been mentioned that Shafa is pretty darn old, we know that like that's gonna happen soon, which also means that like, you know, Nastin's gonna lose her father figure that's, you know, been her father figure for the past 2 books. Although really 2 years, it's been 2 years since the start of the season, and you know, her brother's death, and the fact that like, yeah, like it's been 2 years since her brother's death, and when Essen goes on the road, and when her and Gigi go on the road, like it's been 2 years that have passed. So like it's been a lot of time for her to like, you know, grow fond of Shafa. So obviously like, yeah, it makes sense, but it's also like, yeah, he kind of wanted this to happen. You know, he's been living a really long time, and he's kind of just like, well, here, Nastin, you're about to save the world. You'll be fine on your own. So yeah. And because she's so fond of Shafa, she doesn't want him to die. So her thing is, well, if he turns into a stone eater, he won't die. But in order to like work that around, she has to turn everyone into stone eaters. And she's like, well, humanity is a small price to pay for Shafa's future. And I'm just like, so she's just evil now, apparently. This is like, I mean, yeah, it has happened over time, but it's just like, she's doing all this for this one guy, despite the fact that, like, you know, humanity's gonna all be Stone Age, and she's like, nah, that's fine, as long as Shafa's still alive. And I'm like, please don't do this. This is a bad idea. And as Nastin's coming out of this hole in the ground where Warren is, she sees her mother, because now her mother and company are all in Court Point at the same time as Nastin. So now it's like this kind of moment where they're just looking at each other, and she's like, yeah, I was dad. And, you know, my guardian needs help. And then she's like, oh, Shafa, great. And, you know, Nastin, of course, is kind of just like, no, don't stop me, Mom. I'm gonna, you know, use all the obelisk to, you know, turn everyone stone. And it's like, no, don't do that. You're supposed to be catching the moon. So what Essen does instead is she kind of garners the power of all of them to sort of negate what Nastin's trying to do. So this power becomes way too much. Well, not too much, but like, you know, enough that like, because of the stone and the fact that like, you know, using the power speeds this up, you know, as she's trying to save Nastin, Nastin's looking at her and realizing, you know, she probably like did the wrong thing or is trying to do the wrong thing. You know, Essen turns fully into stone. She, you know, dies the same way the Alabaster, similar to how Alabaster has. So the aftermath, the moon ends up getting recaptured, and, you know, Nastin's kind of like, you know, done with everything. Also, since her hands started turning into stone, she can't use her Eurogeny anymore because, you know, she'll die. So she can't use that anymore. And after this, you know, Hoa talks to Nastin and is like, hey, yeah, you can't use your powers anymore. And also with, you know, the seasons more or less over now, we don't need Eurogenes don't need stills. But he also is kind of like, you know, with the end of seasons and the death of all guardians, it will now be possible for Eurogenes to conquer or eliminate stills if they so choose. And then Nastin's like, well, no, that's horrible, let's not do that. And then, you know, Hoa kind of says like, hey, well, you know that Eurogeny isn't the only way to save the world. And it's kind of like, Nastin's like, oh yeah, you're right. And I'm like, yeah, you didn't think about that before? You had the Stone Eater guy had to tell you that? Apparently that was what she thought, even though, like, you know, Nastin is only like an 11-year-old girl, so I guess that kind of makes sense. And right after this happens, Hoa goes and makes Essen into a Stone Eater. And, you know, they end on this note of like, what do you want? And then Essen's like, well, yeah, I want the world to be better. And then I was like, yeah, that's kind of what I've been trying to do for the past millennia too. I want the world to also be better. Let's shake on it. And that's where the story ends. But yeah, that is the story. I think it does, like, the story and the plot does go a lot faster by the time you get to the second book. I think it is like slow at parts in the first novel, but I think it's just because we're being told from 3 different perspectives, and at a certain point you kind of know it's the same person, but it's still like, in a way, like Essen's origin story, so it does take time for that to unfold. But then by the time we get to the second book, and like from Nassen's perspective and her journey, like it does go by a lot faster. Everything is like a lot more concise, and it's like everything kind of unfurls like one after another, like every event. So I think like when I was reading the second and third book, especially because I read it back to back like right away, at some points I got like mixed up because I was just like, wait a minute, that happened in the second book, right? Not the third book. Like, yeah, I think because I read it so close together, like I think I would recommend it if you read it, space it out a little bit so you don't like have this confusion. Even though like the beginning of the final book, it kind of has this like recap, which is helpful. But I guess it's helpful like if you're like reading it like, you know, more spaced out than I did it. But of course, like, you know, I think a lot of aspects of this book, it's hard to explain unless you have read it or you're currently reading it. You won't understand what I'm talking about. I feel like this whole time I was rambling about something that probably doesn't make sense to the majority of the population that, you know, hasn't read this book or isn't currently reading this book. So yeah, I would leave off by saying it's the kind of book where you just have to read it yourself. I feel like you can discuss it all you want, you can tell people about it all you want, but it's really they have to read it themselves. I think it's really enjoyable. I think it's different from other fantasy in that like it feels grounded more than a lot of fantasy. Like it feels like, despite the fact that it's fantasy slash sci-fi, these are things that happen in the real world. These are struggles, like the struggles that Essen goes through as far as like dealing with, you know, her powers and controlling them and being a Eurogene and having to teach her daughter this, and, you know, kind of being harsh on her because she wants to protect her. And, you know, it's also like this theme of like motherhood and like family and, you know, the idea of communities. Like I think like a lot of these things are real life things that happen, so it's grounded in that way. And obviously I'm not saying like no fantasy has this in it, but, you know, I do think this book reads differently than a lot of other things that I've read. I think like that's a good thing, but it also is like in a way of like you have to get used to it. Like, you know, when you read the first book, I would say like take your time reading it because you kind of have to acclimate yourself with the writing and with really with the world building and like understanding the systems and everything that's going on within the world, and as far as everything going on with the characters and as far as Eurogeny and everything like that. But those are my thoughts all in all on the Broken Earth trilogy. I really enjoyed it. I think it's just the kind of book you have to read for yourself. I'll say it once, I'll say it twice, I'll say it thrice. You have to read the book yourself in order to understand what I'm talking about, because it's the kind of novel, the kind of series that, especially if you're into fantasy or sci-fi fantasy, I think you should read, but I think you should read it yourself. I feel like me telling you about it, you're just gonna be confused. So obviously like you should read it on your own, and that's like really my advice. Like even me talking about it, it felt like in my mind it didn't make sense. It made sense to me, but it's like talking to it out loud, it doesn't make sense unless you have read it. So yeah, that's my final takeaway from this book. It's a great book, but I think if you're gonna read it, just read it. I feel like for me personally, I didn't really read the synopsis, I didn't really read reviews before I went into it. I just went into it blind, and I feel like that's how you should go into it. I think it's actually better to go in blind. Of course, you should probably look at the appendix at the end to like familiarize yourself with the terms and like aspects of the world, but other than that, I feel like it's best to go in with, you know, a blank slate, so to speak. Like you should just go in not knowing anything so you can fully enjoy the actual novel. But that is my review on the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more book-related content. Bye-bye.